So, okay, let's go e4. Well, it's not, it's an office. Okay, so he plays the perk. And I've sort of ranted about not recommending the perk to people, and hopefully I'm going to demonstrate why that is. So he can play e5 here. Okay, that's the Philidor. That's a version of the Philidor. And a lot of people don't understand in this position, why is it that white doesn't take on e5, and then we can take the queen, force his king to lose castling rights. The problem is, when you've traded queens, the king losing its castling rights, it isn't as powerful as when the queens are on the board. So d takes e5 is a move, but we're just going to keep developing with knight f3, which is the main line. Then we're going to develop, okay, so he takes, we're obviously going to take with a knight. And there's several ways that we can go about playing this position. We can go for long castles, we can go for short castles. The way that I like to play this is actually to put the bishop on d3, to lend some more reinforcements to this pawn on e4. That's our only central pawn. So it makes sense to develop our pieces in a way such that we keep this pawn protected. Now, what should we do with the knight? Should we take it? Should we drop our knight back? What do people think? This is actually quite an instructive moment. So I actually think we should not take it. And after the game, I will explain exactly why I believe that. Now, both moves are fine. We're dealing here with marginal differences, but I do think it's an instructive moment in decision-making. We're going to drop our knight back and then continue developing. The basic of it, the long and short of it, is that by taking, we give him more pawns in the center, and we help him orchestrate something like d5, which here would not be possible. Now, the reality is we've got a bigger share of the center than our opponent does, which means white is slightly better. And we've got very free development. So after the game, I'll show some more reasons why I didn't take. Quite an instruct. Now, how should we go about expanding in the center? We can, of course, develop our bishop, but we don't actually always have to do everything strictly by the book. We can start expanding a little bit in the center, and on the king side, we've developed enough pieces to where this is fine. We can deal with this bishop a little bit later. We don't always have to, complete our development by the book. At this level, you've got to be able to improvise a little bit and know when to do something a little bit more ambitious. And he's developed relatively passively, so we can afford this, especially. So rook e8. Now, a couple of things that we could do here, right? We could push this pawn to f5. Now, the downside of that move is that we would give him the e5 square for his knight. That's a very nice central outpost. So in this kind of situation, it's a good idea to make a general improving move. Now, what does that mean? First of all, bishop e3 is absolutely possible, but I'm thinking of a slightly more aggressive move. Let's look at this queen for a second. It's just sort of sitting there on its initials. Can we put it on a nice little square where it's controlling both? Yeah, good job, guys. Queen f3 is exactly what I'm thinking about. Bishop e3 might have walked into knight g4, which would have been a tiny bit nasty. So you'll see this very often. F4 followed by queen f3 is a typical idea. What we're basically doing is we're waiting for him to show his cards, right? He might play d5, and then that'll help us understand how we want to play this. But there are certain positions where you don't know exactly how your opponent is going to arrange his pieces. There we go. See, now there's clarity to the position. We know that he's lost his cool, he's lost his patience. And of course, as we know, we don't want to take here and play into his hands. That's why we played f4. We played f4 partially so that we could meet e5 with d5 with e5, forcing his knight back. Okay, for some reason he just gives up the pawn. I don't see what his compensation is going to be. Now, which way should we take on e4? And this is actually a tricky question that I'm asking you guys. So both moves are fine. Now, the case to be made for taking with the queen is that we are threatening checkmate. But that's actually not the reason that I want to take with the queen. The reason I want to take with the queen consists in this move. I saw that he was going to play g6, and it looks like this battery has been blunted. The AAA battery has run out of power. He's going to go bishop f5. But there is a tactical idea that we have here. If you notice how strong this battery is, can we break through? Let's go, f5. Now, I'll put it this way, guys. This is not as simple as it looks. He's got what I think is... Okay, so of course he falls for it. Bishop takes f5. We take with the rook. This is very typical attacking exchange sacrifice, and he simply has no defense to queen takes h7, which is going to be checkmate. If he tries to move his king, our bishop could come out to h6. He's probably going to do that, would be my guess. King f8. all of the checks are covered, not that they even do anything. There's actually, I think, a semi-refutation to the move f5, which was very complex. I'll show it after the game. He simply resigns. Good. Now, first of all, why not take on c6? So there's a couple of things here. First of all, as I hinted at during the game, do you guys see how even though, yes, it's true, we make more pawn islands, yes, it's true, doubled pawns, but you guys know that I always urge you to put pawn structure in proper context. Pawns may look ugly, but they may actually be fulfilling a very important role. And now d5 is much easier to organize. And this is just like a bumper on a car. You know, it's going to be hard for me to get past that. The other thing is that he gets a b file for his rook. So if I ever try to develop my bishop, he can tickle me with rook b8, and he can potentially either force me to make my rook passive or make the knight undefended. And all these things, you know, taken together, they get annoying. So I decided to drop the knight back. Now, why? Can somebody explain to me why d5 is not possible here, or why is it inadvisable? And another very typical tactical, yeah, evil now is correct. So ed takes, and then in the end the queen hangs. Very typical scenario, bishop h7. If you've solved your fair share of chess.com problems, you should be able to recognize this pattern very quickly. And if you haven't, then, well, here's your introduction to the discovered check. And by the way, if you've gone d5 with black, and your opponent has taken, and you have realized that you've just blundered, it's not too late to double back, right? You can go knight e5 and give up a pawn. It's better than putting your head down and stubbornly going for the losing line. So f4, queen f3, and players in the 1700-1800 rating range have a hard time at times just keeping the tension. I've talked about it before. What my opponent should have probably done is a move like bishop f8, which is a typical move in these positions, dropping the rook back, allowing the rook more influence over the center. Black is slightly worse here. Black is passive, but he's also very solid, and it's hard for white to prove anything immediately. I would have probably developed the bishop, and you know, the battle would have continued. But he kind of lost his cool with d5, knight e4, and actually, after f5, what would have been the annoying sequence? So instead of taking on f5, does anybody see what else he could have done? It's a move that he makes with tempo. He could have gone bishop d5. Now, that doesn't seem like a big problem in and of itself because we can move the queen away. But what you should notice here is this rook on e8. There's two things, the rook on e8 and the fact that as soon as you play the move f4, you absolutely, somewhere in the back of your mind, you need to tell yourself, okay, this diagonal has been weakened. So I need to watch for bishop c5. As weird as it sounds, you have to make that mental note to yourself very, very quick, very, very early in the process so that you get a better chance to see tactics. And if you're alert to that, then you'll see knight takes e5. That's not a blunder. This puts the queen in the x-ray of the rook, and combined with the fact that we played f4, we lose the queen. Obviously, I would not have taken on e5. White can play f6, and the attack continues. But the position gets a lot more messy than it would have been if we didn't do this. So that's actually why, if I was playing another GM, I would have taken with the bishop, seeing that line, because now I'm threatening to win a second pawn, and I've just got a very compact position, and I'm up a pawn. So basically, that's the reason why I think f5 is a little bit objectively dubious, and I just verified that with the engine. Yep, bishop d5 was very strong. Instead, he falls for it, right? Bishop takes f5, and after gf, we would have played rook takes f5. It's the same exact effect. There's simply no defense to the devastating queen takes h7. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions? And please don't be afraid to ask questions. I say this a lot, and I mean it every time. We're here to learn, and I want to make sure everybody's included. And it doesn't matter if you're 200 or 1200. You know, you should never be afraid to ask anything. Born Democracy, thank you for the sub. All right, perfect. If king f8, we would have come back here, and now it's checkmate. So basically, that's how we would have met that. All right. Well, we're 1800. Let's continue. Let's continue. So far, you know, I like the time control. Even though the games have gotten more complicated, they're not like, okay, 2100, wow. Okay, this is a serious dude. Never mind, it's not a serious dude. Yeah, I think he aborted because we were a little low rated. That happens. Okay, Marco 981, damn. That would have been a good opportunity, but we'll get there. We will get there. And he plays the modern. And we've encountered the modern a lot, right? The modern is where you fianchetto the bishop immediately. It often transposes into the perk, but he plays something called the Gurganidze system. It's like a cross between the Caro-Kann and the proper modern. Black prepares to go d5. There's a lot of ways that we can meet the Gurganidze, but one system, which is often very underestimated, is to get the bishop to c4 immediately. The idea is to stop him from going d5. And this is a very common mistake that people make. He simply puts his head as, oh, let me prepare d5. What has he not noticed here? What very subtle move can I make now in order to cement the weaknesses that he's created with this move? And I'll show a game that really influenced me in this. Boom, and look at this juice right there. He's got to go d5. Now we take on Passant. But now look what's happened as a result. His bishop is passive. He's still got a weakness on d6. He's brought his queen out early instead of developing. His position is just going to be very, very cramped. He's going to have a very hard time developing naturally. So we're going to continue our development. Octavarium, thank you for the prime. We're going to continue our development. And in this position, if we look at the tension between the knights, by playing knight d5, he has relinquished his control over a very nice central square, which we can slam our knight into. And of course, you guys can see that potentially we could access d6. Now, how should we continue here? How should we continue developing actively? Very typical move. It should be on the top of everyone's mind. We could play c3, but let's play a little bit more ambitiously. Let's try to induce f6, which would be a horribly weakening move. Thank you, Lich D's Nudes, for the prime. Appreciate that 3 a.m. support, guys. Loving the energy as we move toward 5,000 subs. Can't believe it. Whoa, 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 whoa. Knight f6. Okay, so he's pinned himself. It would be great if we had a chance to apply pressure on the knight. Unfortunately, we don't. So what we need to do here is realize, okay, his position is super passive. We need to sort of lay it on. And we lay it on by, and you guys are seeing this move, by centralizing our knight. And look at the disparity in the piece. He's got to play h6. And he doesn't do it, and that's going to cost him tremendously because we need to have what I call a wish list. And this wish list, right, it has to be updated on every move. I want to do this, okay? And this might not be possible one move, but if you keep kind of mulling that wish list over in your mind, now you see, as a result of us putting in the knight on e5, we can bring the queen out to f3, and his knight is going to simply be lost. And once we take the knight, okay, we just take on f6. The knight is, even if it wasn't defended, and he gave up his fianchettoed bishop, well, thank you for that. Even if we didn't take the queen, we would be able to deliver the lobster pincer-mate. Well, that was pretty simple. But basically, his big mistake was this move e6. And this is something that you guys should be very attentive to. This idea of like cementing these dark squared weaknesses exists across a pretty wide range of openings, believe it or not. And there was a very famous game by Tigran Petrosian, believe it or not, against a very competent player where he demonstrated how bad it can be to allow a weakness of this sort. Game that I was referencing, Petrosian against Pachman, it was a grandmaster. And Pachman does something very similar. Do you guys see that he has created these two weaknesses? Guess what move Petrosian plays here? Pachman didn't realize that he was preparing it by playing rook e1. What does Petrosian do here? He plays e5. Exactly, same exact thing. Pachman plays d6, much like our opponent did. And, you know, Black has all of these weaknesses now that he's got to deal with, and Petrosian starts harassing him, much like we did. You can see the same moves being played. Knight e5, bishop develops with tempo. It's the same elements, and Petrosian won very quickly. So you can see the generalizations that we can make here. Now, if he doesn't go d5, then we can get our knight to d6. That would be even more disastrous. But basically, we just develop naturally. We attack his queen. Now, he should have moved his queen. But now, using an idea from earlier in the day, we can try to chase his knight away by first moving our bishop back and then advancing our pawn to remove the knight from d5. So he's in huge trouble already. But here, it was his last chance to go h6 and forcibly end the pin, although it's still very, very bad. Bishop f6 and queen f3 comes to mind. Boy, oh boy, if he has to take this, I mean, look at these squares. The rook comes in. This is absolutely devastating. Why did you choose queen f3 over knight g4, asks Ezra Zev. Yeah, so knight g4, I was a little worried about knight bd7. Although here we could have gone queen f3, so it was equivalent. But the purpose of queen f3 first is if he goes knight d7, we can take the knight. I think we can just tolerate it, King Guitar. Why is f6, asks Noah New 200, such a weakening move for black? Well, it's just sort of the general effect. If you look at this move visually, right? It weakens the e6 pawn. It blunts the bishop. If he castles, there's just going to be more air in front of his king, right? There's a sense in which he's just, ugh. And just look at this move, right? Everything here just kind of becomes weak. And that's all I mean, right? It's just a visual thing almost. And in particular, this pawn on e6 is a sitting duck because the e-file is semi-open. So when you're judging pawn weaknesses are especially disastrous when there's no opposing pawn on the file in which can be attacked. So if there was a white pawn on e3, then the pawn on e6 would not be such a big deal. But because the rook can come to e1, it has a direct line of fire to the pawn, which means that we need to be very careful before we make a weakness like this. Yeah, if he goes g5, I drop it back. But all of this creates even more weaknesses. You give up the pawn. So this never works, right? When you push pawns like that, you almost invariably create too many weaknesses. Even if you end up winning a piece, your position often remains so weak that it's not worth doing it just because you won't be able to contain all of the weaknesses as a result. Let's continue. Can I play the modern as black? Sure. I wouldn't mind doing something like that. Showing how it should be played, because the modern used to be one of my main openings. So I am going to play the modern, which I've never done before. Yeah, it looks like this guy's going to have some connection problems. Now the modern, as the name reveals, is a hypermodern opening. Hypermodern openings, I remind you, they really began in the 1920s, when there was a group of chess players that included Richard Reti, the Reti opening, and they said, why is everybody saying that you have to control the center with your pawns? I don't think that's entirely the case. Here's what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to let our opponents control the center with pawns, and then we're going to attack those pawns from a distance with pieces that we put on very specific sheltered positions. It's like trench warfare. We're going to put a bishop on g7. We're going to fianchetto that bishop. We're going to provoke all these moves, and then we're going to attack that center with our pieces. That's the sort of rationale behind the hypermodern openings. Thank you, Hydrocow with the prime. Yeah, this guy is having bad connection. And, okay, I'll give him a draw. I offered him a draw. I obviously don't want to take his rating, given his internet. He's declined it. Okay, well, I guess in that case, we'll have to play. Yeah, I'm not sure why he declined it. I think he didn't see it. So, well, what is the point of G? Well, the point is to do what's called a fianchetto. That's an Italian term, which means to deploy the bishop on the longest diagonal on the chessboard. And you can understand, right, just intuitively, that the bishop controls, mathematically speaking, more squares when it sits on the long diagonal. And in addition, you can see that even though he's occupied the center, our bishop now immediately applies pressure on that pawn. So now we have to develop our pieces in such a way as to apply consistent pressure on his center while also developing our pieces in a healthy fashion. That's a hard thing to do, which is why modern's a hard opening to play well. Okay, I'm sorry, he lost on time, so we're just going to have to move on. Thank you for the sub, Uzako91. Okay, moving on. Hopefully we can... Oh, we're playing E-Dog. So we'll play another modern. And let's see if he goes e4 to transpose. If not, we'll play the King's Indian. Maybe I should have just started with the King's Indian. So he plays the London system. And I'm going to play the King's Indian setup against the London system to show you guys how to deal with it with the King's Indian setup. No, he can play e4, and I'll explain later the transpositional issues. Now, the thing is here, the thing is interesting. We haven't developed our knight to f6, and we can actually use that as a good thing. Why is that a good thing? Because it might be easier for us to prepare the move e5, striking in the center. Now, we can't play e5 immediately because he's got 1, 2, 3 defenders on the square, and we've got only 1, 2 attackers. How can we prepare the move e5? And how can we prepare it in such a way that after e5 de, we don't allow a queen trade? Knight d7. That's a very typical King's Indian move. it's more common than going knight c6, because knight c6 keeps that line of negotiations open between the queens, which might result in us losing castling rights after we go e5. Now we can go e5. Yeah, you can play c5 in these positions too, but it's more King's Indian-y to go for the e5 pawn break. That's more principled. Now, a couple of things, right? First of all, let's not go knight f6 because that would blunder the pawn. But we still need to develop the knight. And we need to be very careful about how we do this. One option is to develop it to e7. Another option is to reinforce the pawn on e5 preemptively and then deploy the knight to its traditional square on f6. How can we defend this pawn preemptively? And I don't want to hear anybody say f6 because you know where that leads. We can play queen e7. Actually, we're following, I think, a game that I played in 2013 exactly in this position. So now we keep our options open. Maybe we'll play knight h6, knight f5 as one person suggested. It depends what he does. Okay, so he's allowed us to go knight f6, which means we will. This isn't like that theoretical, but I've definitely seen games like these before. So now we have a nice compact position. Pawn on e5 is protected. And, well, we'll see what he does. But, I mean, for white, you know, he needs to also complete his development. So he's probably thinking about where to put this bishop. No, I don't plan to castle queenside. That would be a little bit too much because that would involve me fianchettoing the other bishop. It would be interesting, but let's play it more traditionally by castling. Now, obviously, we have the question of this bishop. What should we do with this? I just mentioned it, but what should we do with this bishop? How do we develop it? Because remember, if we move this knight, we might drop the pawn on e5. We don't want to do that. And that's where the fianchetto is so good. Fianchettoing is really good when the bishop can't develop along its sort of main diagonal because there's some sort of traffic, right? Or there's a piece that cannot move. That's where fianchettoing comes in. So double fianchetto, both bishops are fianchettoed, crisscrossing the board. I kind of like those types of setups. Knight h5 was possible for sure. There's different ways to play this position. We're doing it in a more traditional way. We're sort of developing, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you could also play it a little bit more creatively. So the move e4 would be a very instructive mistake, and I'll explain why. We actually might be almost following that game I played in 2013. I'll show you guys what I mean. So the move e4, yeah, would have been a little bit weakening. Okay. Welcome to all 3,000. I'll be finishing in about 15 minutes, though. So where do we go from here? What's going to be the plan of action? Well, it depends on what he goes h3. Again, no need to reinvent the wheel. Let's simply identify pieces that are not doing anything and bring them into the game. Exactly. Rook d8 is a start. And while we're doing it, right, and we don't want to go rook e8, though. Rook e8 would be unnecessary because we have enough defenders on the pawn already. Or do we? Because here's the thing. If we look at the position carefully, right, you guys can see that we're occupying this d-file. So wouldn't it be nice if we could move this knight out of the way so that the rook could actually do something on that d-file? Well, there's a problem. If we move the knight immediately, we drop the pawn on e5. That's a problem we've already ran into. So we need to solve that problem before we move the knight from t7. And some of you have already suggested ways that we can do it. We can go knight h5. Exactly. The point is, of course, we want to take this bishop and ruin his structure. But the main point of this move is to open up the bishop's defense of the pawn. Now we can go knight c5. Now we can go knight c5, and we can allow our rook better control of the d-file. It shouldn't blunt my bishop, but again, sometimes the position gets complex, and not every one of your pieces will be ideal. But you can see that we're sort of opening up our control over the board. This bishop is super nice. It's sort of really sizzling through the board. It's a good bishop. And isn't the bishop still pressuring? Well, yeah, our bishop is defending a very important central pawn. Remember, I've said this many times. One of your pieces or more can be performing a defensive role. There's nothing wrong with that. So we have several ways that we can go about. He's actually made a mistake. He's blundered a pawn. Now, what knight f1 has done, if we look at all of our pieces, what has he allowed us to do? What has he allowed us to do? Absolutely. And we don't do this to ruin his pawn structure. We do it to ruin the pawn structure because his king is there. And now we have a fork. It's a very unusual fork. How do I find it? undefended pieces. You should always be looking out for them. This is an undefended piece, and pawns are included in that equation. So we see several weak pawns have been created as a consequence of the trade. And combining these observations, the bishop and the pawn, queen to h4 comes to mind, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn. That's a pretty disastrous loss for him because his king is going to get caught in the crossfire. Okay, so it's not only important as a standalone concept to look for undefended pieces, but particularly when there's been a big time trade, right? When you've ruined a structure like this, you should expect that there will be new weaknesses that are created, which might be the subject of a fork. So you exploit a previously undefended piece and something that's just been created. Bingo. Let's take the pawn. And now we're going to hatch a plan to continue the kingside attack. Obviously, we're attacking on the king side. So knight g3. Well, if we take the knight, well, there's no reason not to take the knight. Let's clear up some of the tension here so we can better understand the situation. And now we need to find a way to, as I say, add some Tabasco sauce to the king side. And Tabasco sauce can come in various forms. It would be nice if we had a rook lift, but we really don't have a rook lift because there's too much pawn traffic. So that leads us to the thought, well, okay, if there's pawn traffic, we might as well use our pawns. And so the move f5 comes to mind, right? We just drive this pawn to f4. We clear some of that pawn traffic. Let's get our queen back first. And that opens up the potential for a rook lift through f5. Thank you, Rashid. Appreciate the 5 months. My man. Okay, so he stops us in our tracks. Question you ask yourself immediately. When a pawn is pushed like this, what weak squares have been left behind? And also there's many ways in which we can go about this. e4, very nice, guys. Good observation skills. But I'm going to show you guys a slightly different approach, which is to use your pawns as battering rams, right? This pawn on f4 looks like it's solid as a rock. But what can we do to try to get this pawn out of the picture so that we can then go f4 and continue the attack? It's a typical idea. g5 is absolutely correct. Now, what makes me think that I can get away with such a move? Well, this isn't even really a sacrifice. If he takes on e5 after f4, just intuitively you should realize that with a king like this, there's just no way he's going to survive. We could trade queens here. That wouldn't be the worst idea, but obviously we want to end the game with a checkmate. So we're going to drop the queen to g6 onto a square where it x-rays the king. I didn't just choose a square at random. Now, we don't even need to play f4. We can collect the pawn first. No need to rush with that move. Now we can go f4, right? So when you can collect the material back, there's no need to force yourself to sacrifice. Okay, he gives us a check. Now the problem is going to be that if his bishop moves away from g3, what move are we going to have to end the game? Well, and hopefully our opponent will allow us to show this. Of course, we go f3. Typical lobster pincer idea, winning the other bishop with checkmate. And that's over. He's got to give up this bishop, and the attack rages on, and yeah, the game is over. So one simple idea really did it in. Yep, f3. Okay, so again, we don't need to rush to take the bishop. Let's actually bring some more beef to the g file. Okay, now we have to take it. Okay, let's just simplify. Now notice that there is a line of fire to the king, so we can just take a bunch of this stuff. Okay, he's threatening bishop e5, so let's cover that and checkmate with a knight. Sorry, I had to go a little bit fast in the end. Okay, that was an interesting game. So here, let's actually compare that game I referenced. To you guys from 2013. Let me see if I can find it. All right, so basically, yeah, actually it was exactly the same thing. This position was reached in one of my games. And he went c3. So very, very similar, as you guys can see, queen e7. Literally, oh my god, I think this was the exact same position. Yep, so with the difference that my opponent had his bishop on e2 and Edog had his bishop on c4. So literally, I did exactly the same stuff, and I did go e5 and get my knight to d3. So you can see that if you take your games seriously, you can learn from them, and you can apply them directly to your blitz game. So I had an inkling that that was what I was doing, but I didn't remember how similar it actually was. So in any case, b6 to fianchetto the bishop. But basically everything we did was very much Very much straightforward. And e4, knight d3 becomes an idea here. It's exactly what we practiced for. And knight f1 was the big mistake. So Idog could have considered b4, attacking the knight. Now, what nice tactical move does black have in this position? Yeah, so I don't know if you guys mean g4 or b4. We'll consider both. So b4 attacks the knight. We don't automatically move our knight. We ask ourselves, can we counterattack one of his pieces? We actually can. What move can we play? Bingo, e4. We attack his knight. If he moves his knight, we have knight d3. And if he takes twice, much like in my game, we have c5, winning the knight. Number one. Number two, if he takes his knight, our knight, then we take his. And this pawn is like a flamethrower, right? This pawn's going to disappear, but it's going to take a big chunk of the kingside security with it. And this check comes. White's position is completely devastated. Not to mention, we can just win back the pawn if we want it. What does the computer say your accuracy was? 99.9. I don't think so. My accuracy, if you're curious, was... No, definitely not 99%. 95.7. Good, but I'm sure some inaccuracies were committed. Now, if he goes g4, then that just creates a huge weakness. I mean, look at how much it weakens his king. We can just drop our knight back. And even if we give up the pawn, that doesn't matter because we've already done... Actually, we have a tactic here. Ooh, black has a very pretty tactic here. Noticing that this knight is overloaded, what can we do to it? Now, if we take the knight, then the other knight replaces it. But that's what should set your brain in motion. Aha, what if we take that other knight? Queen takes, we take this knight. If the knight takes, then we take the bishop. We've got two pieces for a rook and a huge attack. So basically, well, queen h4 was a fork. Takes, get these pawns back. g5 using the other pawn as a battering ram, trying to dislodge the f4 pawn, right? And we could have absolutely gone knight e4 as well, trying to get a rook to d2. Many roads lead to Rome here. And it was probably just as good, if not even better, but I wanted to sort of, to go after him more directly. So basically that was... What if he had placed the bishop on h4 instead of h2? Well, he couldn't have done that, right? Because we would have just taken it. But maybe there was a different moment. Oh, yeah, so he could have gone to h4. In fact, he probably should have. But here, and when you have to deal with a situation like this, what do you guys think I should cover on f6 with? Sohrab, please stop. I am active on YouTube, and let's be productive. Yeah, bishop f6, because the bishop is kind of bad anyway. And trading that piece is kind of good for us. Now, I know we create a little hole here, but at least we've traded off a piece that's suboptimal, right? Now, some of you guys are looking at this and saying, well, how did I know to play g5? Doesn't this weaken my own king? And I always repeat the same thing here. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs. In chess, at some point, you have to take risks, right? You can't have it all against good players. You'll have to take measured risks, such as, yes, slightly exposing your own king. Could this backfire? It can. Has it backfired in my career? Absolutely. But that's just part of the beauty of the game, is making those judgment calls, okay?